Good evening, everyone. I think we're still waiting for a few people to filter in to tonight's Talking History, our inaugural virtual Talking History for 2020. Well, we'll do a bit of housekeeping in a minute. I just want to first acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Kaurna people tonight. We're broadcasting from Kaurna land, and that our speaker this evening is also coming to you from Kaurna land. The History Trust recognises that Kaurna and other First Nations peoples' living cultures and connection to country began in time immemorial and continues into the present day. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we affirm our commitment to the truth-telling called for in the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a necessary contribution to reconciliation and the co-creation of a positive future here in South Australia. Now listen, I said, my name is Christy Kokiki. I'm the Director of Public Engagement here at the History Trust of South Australia. Our Chief Executive, Greg Mackey, for those of you who usually attend Talking History in person at our Torrens Parade Ground. Greg Mackey unfortunately can't be with us tonight. He's really sad to be missing this first inaugural virtual Talking History event. So in a moment we'll play you a pre-recorded video, that message of welcome that he's recorded for you. This is very different. We're going to be coming to you virtually for the rest of 2020. And while we do really miss gathering and connecting together over our shared love of history, or, you know, maybe a glass of wine and cheese, we are excited to be coming to you tonight virtually and streaming straight into your lounge rooms or your studies, your bedrooms. And look, while nothing replaces those physical gatherings, you know, these are strange times, and we're really excited to come to you virtually. And I guess for us, one of the silver linings of this, if there can be silver linings during COVID-19, is that it's enabled some of our regional audiences to join us, where physically that's really impossible usually to drive down to the city on a cold winter's evening to attend our physical gathering. So we're really, really excited to come to you virtually. Listen, we're a bit of housekeeping. We're a really full house tonight. I think we're at capacity. We're expecting 100 people to join tonight for this lecture that is being delivered by Ian Hamilton. So if we encounter any technical difficulties, if you drop out over the course of this lecture, don't panic, don't worry, just try and rejoin, and we've got people working behind the scenes that will readmit you into the webinar. Worst case, if you drop out and you really can't get back in, we are recording this session and we will make it available on our digital channels, and we'll send out to our mailing list as well. So if you do miss out, if you do drop out for any reason and you can't rejoin us, you'll have the opportunity to tune in at a later date. Now, usually when we hold our physical events at the parade ground, we'd point out toilets and emergency exits, so we don't have to do that tonight. Hopefully you all know where your toilets are and where your emergency exits are. And if you haven't already, now's probably a good time to grab yourself some refreshments. I'd ask you to turn off your mobile phones, but you know, we won't hear you. So, but you're going to be listening to me for another couple of minutes. So if you don't have some refreshments, now's a really good time to do that. So just some webinar rules, I guess. Well, not rules. They're just to ensure that we run really smoothly tonight. Everyone is muted. Just to make sure that our focus is on the speaker, Ian, who we'll introduce momentarily. And you can't see each other. But a really important way to feel part of a community when you're attending a webinar like this, and I notice a lot of people are already doing it, is to use the chat function. So there's a little chat icon most likely down the bottom of your screen. If you click on that chat function, you can type a message to everyone else attending the webinar. Now, you may have a couple of options for how who you're sending that message to. You want to ensure that you're sending it to all panelists and attendees, unless you're making a private comment to the panelists. But it's a really great way for everyone to jump in and tell each other where you're from, where are you tuning in from, is it near, is it far? And it's also really good for the speaker because Ian also can't see you, and you don't get that usual feedback that you get when you're physically presenting and telling stories or presenting a lecture to people. So it's really lovely to actually get some of that feedback in the chat, and we'll be exporting that chat at the end so that Ian can see all of the lovely words of encouragement and actually see where you're all tuning in from tonight. Now, what we will do though is ask you to use the chat to make comments and feel part of the community. But if you have specific questions for Ian, and questions we'll address at the end of Ian's presentation, but there's also a Q&A function down the bottom, probably also down the bottom of your screen, a little Q&A icon. If you would like to ask a question of Ian, please put it into the Q&A. If you put it into the chat, by the time we get to the end of Ian's talk, we won't be able to scroll back and find your questions. So the Q&A function is designed to manage questions in a webinar environment. And what you can also do is, if someone else has asked a similar question to you, is you can just upvote it, and we'll make sure that the most popular questions get answered by Ian tonight. And look, if we run out of time and we don't get to your questions, Ian has, I believe, graciously agreed to potentially answer some of the questions afterwards as well. And we'll also make those available online for you. So just one last thing before I'll play Greg's welcome video, our Chief Executive, Greg Mackey's welcome video to you. I just want to give a quick shout out to the History Trust team. It's no small feat to turn some of these programs into virtual programs, and the team has done a really, really awesome job. I'm really proud of the History Trust and how we've all pulled together, and we've also been really fortunate to have fabulous speakers who have all been generous enough to deliver their lectures and share their knowledge with us in this format. And particularly tonight, because you can't see all of our History Trust team, but tonight we do have the fabulous Britt Burton and Catherine Manning in the background, managing all the technical wizardry that goes into producing these webinars. So a quick shout out to Britt and Catherine, and thank you very much for making everything work here tonight. And they're also monitoring the chat and the Q&A function for us as well. Great, so it looks like lots of you are putting in your hellos and where you're from the in the chat, which is fabulous. I'm going to now share my screen and play you the welcome video from Greg Mackey before I briefly introduce Ian.
Hello everyone, my name is Greg Mackey. I'm the Chief Executive of the History Trust of South Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the very first of our Talking History webinars for 2020. Of course, many of you are well familiar with the format of a live gathering at the Drill Hall at the Torrens Parade Ground, and for obvious reasons related to COVID-19 and public health, we have decided to move the program for 2020 to an online format, and so you will be able to find more information about this year's program via our Facebook page. I'm delighted that we have Ian Hamilton this evening presenting to you on the regeneration of South Australia's heritage churches. He's a great expert in the area, and I'm sure you're going to find his presentation interesting. We have to make sure that you're safe, and this is why we're doing the webinar format. We look forward though very much to being able to welcome you back to the Torrens Parade Ground next year. Meanwhile, keep in touch, check out our Facebook page, check our website, and of course, if you are interested in virtually attending one of our Talking History seminars, then please register via Eventbrite. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Great, so look, we'll get straight in. Ian Hamilton is a registered architect here in South Australia with over 30 years professional experience working in private practice in both Australia and the UK. He established Arcuate Architecture in Adelaide in 2016 to pursue his passion, which is to work with church congregations and their places of faith. And before becoming director of Arcuate, Ian was a senior conservation architect with the State Heritage Unit for South Australia and the Senior Heritage Architect with Grieve Gillett Anderson. So he's no stranger to the heritage sector. So tonight, Ian's going to talk about his passion for working with churches and the new initiatives being employed by Arcuate to conserve and regenerate South Australia's heritage churches. And just a quick reminder that if you have questions throughout, put them in the Q&A and we'll come back and answer them with Ian at the end of his fabulous talk. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Christy. I hope that's looking okay. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's a rather unusual circumstance, and I hope this talk goes smoothly. But what I'd like to do is just give you a brief introduction to the practice, my practice, Arcuate. A lot of this information is on our website, but we're very strong on our core values and we're very strong on our purpose. And our purpose is to enrich the quality of life of individuals and communities, which I think is what every architect really should endeavour to do. We have a passion for carrying out repairs and for designing adaptations to places of faith that give them a sustainable future. We have a small team, that's myself and my wife works part-time as an office manager. And we have a very capable architectural assistant, Hayley. This is our office space in Glen Osmond. We have a home-based office. This space accommodates about 4 people, and we have a meeting room next door. And what I just briefly want to start with is just giving you a bit of an oversight as to what I'll be talking about. So I'm going to begin by talking about the situation before South Australia. Then I'll go on to talk about regenerating places of faith events that I've been involved in running in the time I've been in South Australia. I want to talk about fabric repairs and conservation work that Arcuate has been doing. And then I want to go on and talk about strategic master planning in various forms that, again, Arcuate has been involved in. So before South Australia, it's interesting to note, before the establishment of the colony of South Australia, the kind of conditions in which people lived in the UK, because the establishment of the colony was obviously established in the United Kingdom at a time in the early 19th century when the cities throughout the UK were incredibly crowded and incredibly disease-ridden, and there was terrible typhoid, terrible cholera, terrible overcrowding, and the idea of actually traveling to a far distant country and setting up a new life must have been incredibly appealing to many people at the time the colony was established. I read with great interest Max Carter's book, No Convicts There, which is a wonderful history, a wonderful description of the times of around about when the colony was established. And the very idea that when you got on a ship from the United Kingdom and you travelled to South Australia back in 1836, it would have been the last time that most people would have seen their home country. It was very rare for people to return back to Britain. Now, the context in which the colony was established and the churches that were built at that early stage, I'm going to quote a couple of things from 2 books. One is from Adelaide City of Churches, which is a jubilee celebration of 150 years of South Australian churches by John Whitehead. And to quote him, he said, "Respectability and good health were among the criteria on which people were selected, that is, to go to colonise South Australia. These and the expectations implicit in the South Australia Act were among the factors that led to early Adelaide being a relatively sober-minded and religious city, earning the name City of Churches." And then the next book that I'm quoting from is Adelaide, A Sense of Difference by Derek Whitelock. Now, to quote him from that book, from the outset, South Australia was to be a pure moral contrast from the rum and convictism of the Eastern Australian colonies and the fecklessness of the surviving Swan River settlers. It was to be a happy utopia of free religious conscience, progress, and profit. There were to be no convicts and almost no alcohol. So I think what that does is it sets the context of the establishment of so many churches, and this image, of course, shows Trinity Church on North Terrace, the very first church to be built in South Australia. Now, this is a rather large jump. So this is before South Australia, from my own point of view, and in my experience in working with churches within the United Kingdom. I worked for a very well-respected architectural practice in Glasgow called Page and Park, and as well as being a great design practice, it was responsible for doing many church conservation projects. And this is one of my favorites. I worked on many churches when I was there, but this is probably my favorite. It's a James Salmon Jr. designed building that was completed in 1899 in the arts and crafts, sorry, in the Art Nouveau style. James Salmon Jr. was a very good friend of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And this building was built for a small congregation which expanded extremely quickly, and they actually had to build a new church building, which, if you see on the images on the bottom left-hand side of the slide, is you can see the image of the larger church by an architect, a well-known architect called James Miller, and this was designed in the arts. That was designed in the arts and crafts style. So what happened was the original James Salmon Church, the smaller of the two churches, became a church hall, and the image in the center on the left-hand side shows the church hall as we found it when we were engaged as architects to work on this building. Because what had happened is the congregation had shrunk we were engaged around about 2005. The congregation had shrunk. The bigger church had become dilapidated. The congregation couldn't afford to upkeep that church. It was sold for property development, and we were engaged to house the congregation back in the original church building. And we had to find ways that we could actually provide them with all the accommodation that they required within their remodeled church. And in doing that, we built for them some accommodation within the main nave, which touched very lightly upon the existing fabric within the nave and reflected this wonderful curved roof structure that we exposed as soon as we took away the suspended ceiling that was within the hall. And we were able to reestablish this wonderful roofscape, and we used pews from the larger church to construct this piece of what we thought of at the time as almost like a piece of furniture. But this actually holds toilets, kitchen, a vestry, and storage, and sits within the main nave of the church. So that was a wonderful project. And this is another project again in the east end of Glasgow at Shettleston. And the idea of this was to provide a new building that acted as a shop window to the street, to enable the passers-by on the main road to see into the community activities within the church and give that sense of life and activity within the church that hitherto didn't exist with the former building, which is the darker red brick building, where there was no sense of visibility into that building. So this was all about literally creating a shop window to the street for the church's activities. Now, jumping on to when my family and I arrived in South Australia 8 years ago, it was my wife's job that brought us to South Australia. I was looking after the young kids that we had, 7 and 9-year-old at the time, and I worked part-time for the State Heritage Unit. And of course, having had an interest in churches and having been heavily involved in them in Scotland, I was fascinated by the idea of going to Adelaide, to a city of churches, Adelaide, and was very quick to take a view on the condition of many of the churches, and these two images are probably of two of the finest churches within our city, within Adelaide. The one on the left-hand side is an image of the oldest part of St. Francis Xavier Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral, of the Welsh slate roof, and you can see that with many of the slates have become dislodged and are sitting in a rather higgledy-piggledy fashion along the gutter line. The church on the image on the right-hand side is actually St. Peter's Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in North Adelaide, and it's actually in almost as bad a condition. The difference is that the image on the left-hand side is over 150 years old, that section of roof. The image on the right-hand side is only 30 years old, and it was a rather poor Welsh slate that was specified on the Anglican Cathedral back in around about 1990. And because of the poor specification of that slate, it's actually become, it's actually in pretty poor condition, because the slate has literally rusted and is full of holes. There will be lots of holes and water ingress. So this actually needs to be replaced almost as urgently as the picture on the image of the roof on the right-hand side. So this is just a couple more images showing typical issues, typical problems with churches that I became very aware of very quickly when I started working in South Australia. One image shows on the left-hand side, these are both of Clayton Wesley Uniting Church on the Parade junction of the Parade and Portrush Road. The image on the left-hand side shows where some embedded metalwork has rusted and blown off a hood molding above the main entrance. And on the right-hand side, it shows a junction of the main tower with the roof of the church, and you can see the asbestos cement slates and the degraded state of the base of the wall and the poor condition of the gutter. And these are pretty typical of many of the sort of issues that I'd observed and that I have observed in doing a lot of fabric condition surveys of churches in South Australia. Many of them are in pretty poor condition. Now, I'm going to move on to talking about regenerating places of faith events, because it does tie with what I'm saying so far. The image on the left-hand side is of a flyer that we produced when I started working for the State Heritage Unit, when we first moved over and I was working part-time. I'd asked, when I started working with them, could I run a conference through the department to focus on how to sustain church buildings. And and that was run through the state government and through Australia ICOMOS in conjunction with the Anglican Church of St. John's in Halifax Street. And that was a successful event, but it was talking essentially about how to repair church buildings. Moving on 18 months, sustaining places of worship, the series became, this event in 2014, in March 2014, was practical conservation. So again, we were looking at practical conservation, but in the context of how can churches raise funding in order to conserve themselves as well. It was, and again, it was the same partners, but at that time I was working with Grieve Gillette and they helped sponsor the event, and that was another successful event. But jumping on to almost to the current day, those events expanded and developed, the partnerships grew, and it reached the point where we have all the main church denominations. We have the Catholic Archdiocese, the Anglican Diocese of Adelaide, we have the Lutheran Church, we have the Uniting Church, we have National Trust, we have Australia ICOMOS, South Australian government still involved, Arcuate obviously still heavily involved, and we have a wide range of partners who help us run these regenerating places of faith events. And the image that I'm showing there was from a slideshow, a presentation that I gave at the 2019 event last year. And the focus has, as time has moved on, has been more upon how churches can think differently about how they connect with their communities, how they reach out and use their buildings to connect with local communities. That's essentially been largely what I've spoken about over the last number of years. And a lot of what that where that has stemmed from has been the experiences that I had working in the UK before I came to South Australia. And pivotal to what I've spoken about at many of these events over the last number of years has been this book by Becky Payne called Churches for Communities. And what Becky talks about is churches in Oxfordshire, particularly within Oxfordshire in England, which has a very high proportion of historic churches, and a decision that was made by the Church of England around about 20 years ago to positively adapt its historic church buildings to find ways that local communities could become more involved with the churches. So very much an outreach, very much about being much more adventurous about how historic churches could be used to serve their communities, to create community connections that not only sustain the church buildings, but help to build the congregations at the same time. And for example, this is the Church of St. John the Baptist in Stadhampton. Now this is a wonderful historic church that sits in a small village that the village itself required at one point some new community facilities. And they thought very hard about spending money on a village hall. But in actual fact, they had a perfectly serviceable church which was 800 years old. It had never had a toilet in the church at all. It had very basic electrics, no heating. It was damp, it was run down. And the decision was made to actually, instead of building a separate village hall, to actually adapt the church itself to serve not only as a place of worship, but also as a village hall. And they made some very bold decisions about how to do that. They actually, they lifted the floor and put underfloor heating in. They insulated the whole building, but they actually built a kitchen, a communal kitchen, into the side aisle of the historic church. They built a very sensitively incorporated, some toilets into the base of the tower as a new build, and they took all the pews out of the church, and they basically created a village hall within the church, and it's a wonderful story of how that church then has a new lease of life, and has a much stronger link to the local community as a village hall, as well as a place of worship. And this is St. Thomas of Canterbury in a place called Goring-on-Thames in Oxfordshire. And again, this is perhaps an even bolder intervention, whereby they built a series of community spaces, as you can see on the top left-hand image there, a series of interlinking community rooms along the side of the historic church, and together with a kitchen and toilet areas. And that space links through into the main body of the church, which is the image on the bottom of the screen, where they refurbished, they conserved and repaired the internal nave of the church, and they took all the pews out. So that can become a very flexible community space as well. So these are some pretty bold decisions in adapting what are incredibly important historic churches, but it's something that was perceived to be necessary in order that they be sustainable into the future, and to be able to raise revenue to maintain and repair and maintain those churches moving forward. So I'm going to go on and talk about Arcuate's work with regard to fabric repairs and conservation. So as I've said to you, when I established Arcuate just over 4 years ago now, I carried out two initial fabric condition surveys, which are the images on the report covers of which are the images on the left-hand side of the slide. The first one that I did was a very comprehensive fabric condition survey of St. Francis Xavier Cathedral. And then the second one that followed straight after that was a report on Clayton Wesley Uniting Church, on the complex of buildings involved, because it's not just the church that you see on Fort Rush Road, but it's the chapel behind and the Institute building behind that. So that was a pretty comprehensive survey. The two images on the right-hand side, they are the two most recent fabric condition surveys. The St. Mary's is on the far right-hand side of this slide, and it's actually the oldest Catholic church in South Australia. That's the survey that I did in June this year. And then next to that is St. David's Anglican Church. That complex of churches was the subject of a fabric condition survey that I did back in April. So you can see, I mean, these are 4 of perhaps 25 surveys that I've made, or thereabouts, that I've done since establishing Arcuate. So I've got to be very familiar with the kind of issues that these churches have in terms of their ongoing maintenance and repair. And as part of that knowledge that I've built up, because I'm conscious that many church congregations do not fully understand what they're faced with when it comes to needing to do fabric repairs and so on, I actually produced a series of guidance notes. I've got 13 guidance notes, which are on the our company website, our Arcuate's website, and they're attached to my LinkedIn account as well. And these guidance notes are really to help churches to understand what they're faced with when the very first guidance note was about roof coverings. The second one was about roof flashings. Third one was about rainwater disposal. They're all about the basic elements of church buildings that require to be inspected regularly and maintained regularly, and understanding when they're not in great condition. So that they're really to help custodians of particularly of heritage churches to understand the condition of their buildings. And this is illustrating a fabric condition survey that I did of St. George's Anglican Church in Gawler. So the report covers on the left-hand side, and just a couple of slightly gruesome images of the condition of not only of the stonework but of the roof. Interesting church, because the roof is in very poor condition. I reported that it now, this is several years ago, I reported that it urgently needs to be reslated. But in fact, the church doesn't have any gutters, which is pretty rare. So there's no way that the slates, if they break and if they slide down the roof, which often happens when a slate roof gets old, the slates fixings become corroded and the slates break and slide down the roof. There's no way that these slates stop in the gutters like I showed you in an earlier slide. They don't stop. They slide straight off the roof and land on the ground. And I was very concerned at the time that I did the survey that the ground was littered in broken slate, and that a slate could easily hit somebody who might be passing by beneath. So they've actually put hazard warning tape around this church until such time as they can repair the roof. So that's a really sad condition to be in. But this has been a great success, I have to say. I'm very pleased to say that we won a Heritage Award, for the top Heritage Award from the South Australian Institute of Architects only 2 weeks ago or so, for a very comprehensive refurbishment of Smith Memorial Chapel in West Terrace Cemetery. A wonderful little building that we got to conserve very comprehensively, right from replacing many of the slabs on the flooring flagstones, right up to repairing the cross at the very apex of the tower and everything in between. It was a major refurbishment, even down to repairing and recarving many of the stone features of the building. So it was a wonderful, wonderful project to work on. So strategic master planning. This is a bit of a catch-all title for strategic thinking that we bring to bear whenever we're working with church buildings. And this is one of our earlier sort of strategies for renewal of churches, which is a sort of 5-step initiative whereby we offer to go to churches to not only review their fabric condition, but also to review things such as how spaces within the church are being used, whether they're being used efficiently, whether all of the buildings on a church site are being used to their full potential, whether there might be ways in which they might be better utilized. It's really it's offering to do a brainstorming exercise and a technical assessment of the church buildings, making recommendations and then reviewing the outcome of those recommendations. So it's really a bit of a strategic initiative in itself. Sort of a bit of a jump here. Takes me back to, it's basically illustrating how we actually do, we innovate with regard to church designs, where we see a need to motivate and regenerate a particular church building. And this may seem slightly counterintuitive, but these images show St. George's in Gawler, the church that I spoke about, where the slates slide off the roof. And while they need to replace the church roof because it's in such poor condition, they need to raise, they have to raise revenue in order to be able to pay for those repairs. And in order to raise revenue, there's an opportunity. If there's an opportunity to regenerate the church by, even if it comes to having to build new buildings to do so, and to create these, what I spoke about before, stronger connections with the local community, to bring people from the local community into church buildings, to hire those buildings for a variety of community functions. It helps to build stronger, more resilient relationships between local communities and church communities, but it also starts to mean that church buildings get used more fulsomely, which is, and churches can raise revenue through the use of their buildings. So in a way, what I did here was I suggested that there's a piece of waste ground next to St. George's, in the middle of this square, Orleana Square in Gawler, and I suggested that they actually came up with a whole marketing proposal for developing a community health centre for the mind, soul and heart for the centre of Gawler in Church Hill, which is where this church is based, and I called it the Heart on the Hill. And it was really about developing a series of community rooms adjacent to the church, connected to the church, that could be rented out to the community and could also be used for church activities, but that these community rooms would frame an outside public space that could be used for worship, but it could also be used for a variety of community activities. And this was, we were actually, I didn't really expect it to happen, but we were actually engaged by the Anglican Diocese of Adelaide to develop these ideas, to do 3D visualizations and start building a picture for what this would actually look like, because they got terribly excited about the whole idea of it. And this is one of the 3D images that we produced that shows this community building on the left-hand side of this open space, and a shade structure that might hold barbecue areas and play equipment and so on the right-hand side, and the idea that community rooms could be built into that shade structure should more space be required, and some of the imagery that we've then further developed on what those buildings might look like. And here we went on to work with the Church of the Transfiguration in Gawler, another part of the Anglican diocese in Gawler, where the top right-hand image shows the Church of the Transfiguration in its current form. Really very difficult to see how to get into this building. The most prominent part of the building is the new toilet block. This is the view from the main Adelaide Road. And we really came up with some ideas. We brainstormed some ideas for how this could be given more street appeal, opened up to the street to create views into the building, to the heart of the place of worship, build a new entrance, build a tower that was never built. So these were very, very quick ideas. I'm conscious of my time here, so I'm racing through this bit. The Anglican Cathedral Church of Port Pirie, we did some brainstorming on this, and this building does not relate well to its local community. This is the view that you see from the main road, and we explored ways that we could reactivate the church in a number of different ways, by opening up the entrance to the main road into the town, by activating an area of ground that they had associated with their church hall. These are some sketches that we did to sort of show some ways in which the church could better relate to its environment, to its local community. Long story, and I won't go into it, but there's a narrow space available down the side of the church, and we utilized that to create a structure that would create a foyer that would allow people to see the church in a more positive context on the main road. Anyway, this is we came up with a speculative proposal also for the Clayton Wesley Uniting Church on the Parade, the idea of using their site to generate a mixed-use commercial and residential development that could help to fund the ongoing repair and development of those church buildings that I did a fabric condition survey so early in my time with Arcuate. And we put a whole proposal together for this about 2.5 years ago. Again, not necessarily expecting it to develop into anything, but we were actually engaged in recent times to develop a housing component of that within the site, not the retail component, but a housing component, and that these slides illustrate something of that proposal. And this is another sketch proposal that we did rather speculatively for the Uniting Church in Port Adelaide, where we had developed, we suggested a housing development that connects sensitively to the rear of the church. And we put that to Uniting SA in Port Adelaide, and we get to hear if that's going to develop. We also do master planning. This is St Aidan's Anglican Church on the corner of OG Road and Paynham Road. We were asked to master plan that church site by the Anglican Diocese of Adelaide. I can't go in, I haven't time to go into the reasons for it, but we explored different ways in which the car parking might be better developed and used, how the buildings on the site might be used in different ways. So we explored 5 different options, and we came up with visualizations for how we thought we might be able to regenerate that site. And that's one of a number of visualizations that we created. And one of the most recent ones, St David's, we've been working with St David's Anglican parish in Burnside with their wonderful 1960s church and their adjoining properties, to see how we can again regenerate this whole site in a master planning exercise over a period of 10 years into the future. And that's these are 3D models that we've done of those church buildings as a beginning of that exercise. The other thing we do is we've developed initiatives like strategic asset management planning, which can help with understanding understanding the condition and managing a large number of buildings at the same time. So we looked at developing a strategic asset management plan for all of the churches under the control of the Anglican Diocese of Adelaide, and these are images from that proposal that we put to them. So sorry, racing to the end here. I'm going to review what's been said, but essentially what I've been trying to say is that churches, while there's a wonderful legacy of churches in South Australia, I'm very conscious in having viewed them in the context of my experience of working in the UK, where the UK government specifically provide funding streams to fund historic churches, and we as architects working in the UK were able to access those funds and carry out repairs to church buildings. That does not exist in South Australia. The churches don't get particular priority any more than any other heritage building does. And with the wonderful legacy and really important legacy of church buildings in South Australia, I'm just really concerned about the future of those buildings, especially having observed the poor quality of much of the work that's been done to conserve them in the past. And our practice is all about bringing up the standard, increasing the motivation to improve the standard of repairs and the ways in the more adventurous ways in which churches can be used in the future. The images that I've got here, this is looking down, this is a Google 3D view looking down on St. Peter's Cathedral in North Adelaide. And you can see St. Peter's just in slightly up in the center of the image, slightly to the top. And the next image is really to show and to make you imagine what North Adelaide would be like if St. Peter's wasn't there. If you imagine that St. Peter's reaches the point where it becomes so run down that it actually it has to be demolished, which is the case with many churches around the state. They will reach the point where they're not fully utilized, and they will end up having to be. They'll be so expensive to repair. They're going to have to be knocked down. You know, in the next 50 years or so, if we carry on the way we're going. That if you just imagine North Adelaide without the cathedral, highly unlikely the cathedral will be but it will be knocked down. But it's essentially just to make you think, what would Adelaide be without its churches? So, you know, the cathedral there, the cathedral gone. The same might apply. Here's an image in the center of this picture of St. Francis Xavier Cathedral. And the next image is essentially, imagine viewing from Victoria Square, not seeing the Catholic Cathedral. If you imagine all the churches around the city, and if they weren't there, what kind of city would Adelaide be? Just to finish off, Adelaide City of Churches, book I referred to earlier on, a commemoration in 1986 of 150 years of churches in South Australia, a wonderful legacy of churches, a great celebration. But we are in 15 or 16 years' time, we will reach the 200th anniversary of the establishment of South Australia. And my concern is that we are now living in a city of tired churches. You can see I've adapted the cover of the book there slightly cheekily to say city of tired churches. We have many tired churches, heritage churches, that need a lot of loving and careful repair and repurposing in some ways to think about how they're used into the future. And my hope is that by the time we get to 2036, if we can turn things around in the next 16 years and actually carry out excellent repairs and new ways and offer new ways of thinking about church buildings, we can celebrate that ongoing legacy of churches at the 200th anniversary of South Australia. I've always used this slogan, let's fix it for 36. Let's find ways of fixing our churches so we can celebrate in 2036 this great legacy of buildings. So I'm going to leave it at that. That's essentially got to the end of my talk. So thank you for listening.
Great, fabulous, Ian. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating story of adaptation and regeneration and sort of finding new uses for churches and reconnecting with community. I think everyone listening would be have no doubt that you well and truly deserve that Institute of Architects Award. So congratulations again. You clearly bring a huge passion to this and a real generosity of spirit as well in your practice, which is, it really, really comes through. And thank you also for that pertinent warning about our at-risk churches here in South Australia. Across the whole cultural and heritage sector, we often look to some of the funding models in the UK rather jealously, actually. So it's Yeah, it's interesting to ponder and to think about. Now we do have some questions here. If anyone else has a burning question, put it in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see them, Ian, but I might just read it out for everyone just in case. We've got a question with a couple of upvotes here from Alison, saying so many Protestant churches have been built with sloping floors to give prominence to the preached word. And for example, the high pulpit, the good acoustics for spoken word, and the examples you give are Anglican and with flat floors. What answers do you suggest to those of us who have inherited preaching places with a sloping floor?
Oh, I think the thing that I mean, notwithstanding the fact that I love working with communities and working with church congregations, the challenges that churches present in terms of, as an architect, in terms of adapting them can be enormous. And sloping floors is probably one of the greatest ones. Clayton Wesley has a sloping floor. So yeah, that's a very, very good question. I harbour a desire someday to be involved in the redevelopment of the church at Clayton Wesley and tackling that sloping floor. But the only way that I can realistically see that being done is to find a way of leveling the floor out. And yeah, sorry, I don't have a particular solution to that. It would be a church by church basis, really, in terms of reviewing it. But yeah, you've hit a real issue there.
Yeah, a real curly one. Great. We have another question that's about materials, and so this goes back to the mentioning of the slate roofs. Is it always necessary that slate must be used when restoration is done?
It's a very good question, because up until, I would have said, probably 10 or 15 years ago, the State Heritage Unit, the government's Heritage Department, were relatively flexible about slate roofs, and many churches had original slate roofs that had reached the end of their useful life. They had them removed and they had metal roofs put on in their place. But I know for a fact that the State Heritage Unit have regretted allowing that to happen, and they're now pretty insistent that church roofs be replaced. If it's a slate roof, that it be replaced with a slate roof. And that is a challenge for any church, because they're expensive. They tend to be expensive roofs to replace. But the other argument I would say is, if you choose your slate carefully, like St. Francis Xavier that had a Welsh slate roof, that roof, if constructed properly, can last in excess of 150 years, which is far in excess of any metal roof that you were ever going to get. So the important thing is to choose the right materials and to construct it correctly, because you can get an incredible amount of life out of a slate roof if it's built properly. I'm afraid there's unlikely to be any concessions in changing slate roofs to metal roofs from the State Heritage Unit in the near future.
Yeah, sure. And I think that there's a couple of follow-up comments in the Q&A, which we'll take offline, which might be of interest later. Someone has asked, is the book still available?
Oh, is the book still available? Is this the I haven't got it with me. Is this the 150th celebration?
I assume so. Is anyone able to jump into the Q&A and
I'll be honest with you, I think I saw a copy of it in a second-hand bookshop relatively recently. Yes, I mean, it is available in second-hand bookshops. I'm certain they don't publish it anymore, but I keep my copy very close to me, very close to my heart, because I was delighted to find it. So yeah, I would say it was probably fairly widely published at the time, and I would say if you hunt down enough second-hand bookshops, you'll find a copy eventually. Clearly the Oxfam bookshop the Oxfam bookshop in the centre of town is your best bet from my experience.
Yes, yes, a fabulous bookshop that it is. Now, I'm just, we've got a lot of questions streaming in now. I'm just trying to keep up with them. Oh, and some suggestions. Thank you. Let's see. So there's someone has made a comment wanting to know if you could talk, is interested in knowing more about the concept of strategic asset management planning for churches that you spoke about. And would you like to speak about that a little bit more? What does it involve? And, is it multidisciplinary?
I think it's an amazing tool. And it's the only reason that I'm very familiar with it is because my wife is an engineer, and it's very much a process-driven engineering tool. She does a lot of strategic asset management planning of big engineering type installations where you would have lots and lots of lots and lots of different bits and types of machinery, for example, or defense establishments where you've lots and lots of different buildings. And it's really a way of it's not like asset management. You might asset manage an individual building where you would look at all the services and the electrics and the fabric condition of an individual building. Strategic asset management planning is a much broader, much a higher level kind of overview, which is about looking at whole series of, for example, buildings. The National Trust, I believe, in the United Kingdom use strategic asset management planning to have an overview of all of its properties throughout the United Kingdom, whereby it gives them a sense of what condition their individual buildings are in, and it flags up where buildings might need urgent attention and where other ones are in a reasonably sustainable condition. And it's something that allows you to monitor buildings, or assets on an annual basis. So what you'll find is actually if you type Strategic Asset Management Planning Council into Google, you will find that all the councils throughout South Australia use strategic asset management planning because it allows them to keep keep on top of all the assets that they're publicly responsible for. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. But I think if you Google a little bit about it, you'd find a fair bit about it.
Brilliant, thank you. Great. Look, I'm really conscious of the time. There are a couple of other questions in there that we could just take offline, and we might get Ian to answer them. And there's another slate question and some other stuff. So, but what I'd like to do now is thank Ian again for being our guinea pig, our first virtual Talking History. It can be really hard presenting to an audience and not getting that feedback. So that that physical feedback of being in the room. So it's fabulous that Ian agreed to share his knowledge with us like this. Judging by the chat and the comments, everyone has really enjoyed this, and we are going to export that chat and we'll provide it to Ian. Look, just a reminder, we are recording this webinar, and we will make it available online as a video. We'll also make it available through our podcast in audio for those that want the audio only. So stay tuned, sign up to Talking History on our website if you are not already on the mailing list. We've got a couple of events coming up in August. We've got 2 talks. So now that we're virtual and we don't have the logistics of organising cheese and wine and physical events, we can slot in a few extra events. So again, so sign up to the mailing list and watch out on our digital channels, our website and Facebook in particular. We've got 2 events in August, one on Tuesday the 18th of August and one on Tuesday the 25th of August. The first one is Collecting the World, French Voyages of Scientific Discovery. And the second one on the 25th of August is on British Migrants, Instant Australians, which is a bit of a look and a deep dive into the exhibition that is currently on display at the Migration Museum. So stay tuned. Look, we'd also, like I said, this is the inaugural virtual Talking History for the History Trust of South Australia. And I did also notice in the chat there are some regional audience members and even interstate, which is really fabulous that we can reach an even broader audience through this platform. But we do welcome your feedback. It's really hard to predict what the rest of 2020 will bring for us in South Australia with COVID-19, but our plan is to continue to deliver these virtually until the end of the year. But we do welcome your feedback on the format and any ideas and thoughts that you might have on making them run more smoothly, or thoughts that you might have on different speakers that you'd like to listen to. I think that's really all that we have to say, but other than thank you for supporting this virtual event, and thank you, Ian, for agreeing to be our first speaker. It's been yeah, really fascinating insight into the process that you go through, and it's just really, I guess it's just really encouraging to know there are architects out there who bring this passion to heritage buildings and community rejuvenation and placemaking. It's really, really fabulous. But thank you all very much, and thank you again, Ian, and we'll see you all next month.